They say the sun never sets in the Asheville Highlands during a blood moon season. For 3 weeks, the sky stays the color of molten copper, and the light just hangs there, relentless, exposing, too bright to hide anything that wants to stay buried. I was buried in the Asheville Highlands for 2 years. Not underground, not in any dungeon. I lived in a manor house with 12 rooms, linen drapes on every window, a cellar stocked with imported wine I never drank, and weekly deliveries of food I hadn't asked for from a courier who never spoke my name. The estate was called Ember Hollow, which I thought was almost funny, a hollow place made of dying fire. Whoever had named it had known something true. I am Seraphine Voss. And 2 years ago, I was publicly rejected by an alpha who didn't know what he was throwing away. His name was Callum Rowe, alpha of the Ironspire Pack, one of the 4 ruling packs of the Northern Territories. He was tall and cold-eyed and proud the way men are proud when they've never had to question whether they deserve the things they were given. He found me at the Interpack Convergence, the gathering held every decade where unmated wolves of alpha and beta bloodlines were presented before the council. I was 23. He was 26. I felt the bond snap into place between us like a rope pulled taut, sudden and shocking and undeniable. I looked at him across the stone floor and thought, oh, this is what they meant. He looked at me and said, no. Not privately. Not gently. He said it in front of the entire assembled council, in front of 60 wolves who went very still and very quiet, in front of the painted banners of every ruling bloodline. He said, I reject this bond. The connection is in error. She is no one of consequence. No one of consequence. The woman standing at his elbow, the one he turned back to with a practiced softness in his expression, was named Daria. She had amber eyes and a calculated smile, and she had been maneuvering toward Callum Rowe for 3 years. She had no mate bond with him. She had something she thought was better, a plan. I stood there and felt the rejection hit me like a physical strike, the bond fracturing but not breaking, because it never fully breaks, no matter what words are spoken over it. The wolf inside me howled. I pressed my hand flat against my sternum and breathed through it, and I did not cry, and I did not beg, because there are some things I will not do in front of 60 witnesses. 2 days later I received a letter. It had no return address, only a wax seal, a golden sigil I didn't recognize, an asymmetrical crown with 1 broken tine. The letter said, you are expected at Ember Hollow. Transportation has been arranged. Come alone. Tell no one where you are going. Everything you need will be provided. I should have been frightened. I was frightened. But I was also 23 years old and freshly humiliated, and the bond I carried had nowhere to go, and when the car came I got in. The manor was real. The provisions were real. The courier who came every Tuesday with food and candles and books was real, and he smiled pleasantly and never asked questions and never told me who sent him. I spent the first month waiting for something terrible to happen. When it didn't, I started reading. I read everything in Ember Hollow's library. There were histories of the northern packs going back 400 years, volumes on bloodline lineage and territorial law, treatises on the origin of the anchor bloodlines, the oldest wolf families, the ones whose blood was said to carry the memory of the first wolves, the ones from whom all alpha kings throughout history had drawn their mates when the bond was pure and undiluted. I read those volumes 3 times. And then I read the genealogy charts that were filed at the back of the shelf in a plain leather folder, and I found my name. Seraphine Voss, maternal line, crest of Voss, a minor territory on the eastern edge of the Highlands. Paternal line, blank, redacted, sealed under order of the Alpha Kings Council, notation dated 23 years ago, 8 months before I was born. I sat with that folder for a long time. Outside, the copper sky pressed against the windows. The light just hung there, unmoving. I am telling this story now because it ended. Because what was hidden eventually became visible, the way things always do when the light refuses to go out. But I need you to understand the 2 years in between. What it was to carry a fractured bond and a sealed bloodline and no answers, and to keep waking up anyway, because the only other option was to stop waking up, and that was never something I was willing to do. I ran every morning. The Asheville Highlands are beautiful in the cold, gray and silver and vast, the heather flattened by wind, the ridgeline always sharp against whatever the sky was doing. I ran in human form because I'd made a rule for myself. I would not shift until I had answers. The wolf in me didn't like the rule. She tested it constantly, pressing against my ribs on full moons, making my vision sharpen at inconvenient moments, making my hands glow. The glowing started 6 months in. Not dramatic at first. Just a faint warmth in my palms when I was upset or frightened or very tired. A trace of gold that faded as quickly as it came. I told myself it was the bond reacting, some biological overflow from the fracture. I told myself a lot of things in those 2 years that I later had to unlearn. By the second year, the glow came without invitation. I'd wake at 3 in the morning with my hands lit like lanterns, gold washing the ceiling of the bedroom, the shadows retreating from me as though they knew better than to stay. I'd press my palms together and breathe the way my mother taught me, slow, from the belly, and the light would eventually dim. But it never went entirely dark. There was always a trace, a remainder, something that refused to be extinguished. The dream came for the first time on the night of my 2nd anniversary at Ember Hollow. In the dream, I was standing in a room I didn't know, vast, circular, the walls lined with carved stone wolves in relief, each one caught mid-howl. The floor was black marble veined with gold. There was a fire burning in a pit at the center of the room, and standing at the far side of it was a man I had never seen. He was older than me, not ancient, but carrying the weight of long authority. Tall and broad and gray at the temples, with dark eyes that had the look of someone who has been watching for a very long time and is accustomed to seeing what he watches. He looked at me across the fire and he said, "It's almost time." I said, "For what?" He said, "For them to know what you are." I woke with my hands burning gold and the smell of wood smoke in a room that had no fireplace. The courier came on Tuesday as usual, but this Tuesday he had a second envelope tucked under his arm, cream-colored and sealed with the asymmetrical crown. He handed it to me with the same pleasant smile and waited while I opened it. Inside was a single sentence. "The Alpha of Ironspire has announced his Luna ceremony for the autumn equinox. You will attend." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I wrote back. On a sheet of paper I folded and handed to the courier, who was still waiting, "I have not been invited." The next Tuesday he returned with one word, "You will be." The invitation arrived from Ironspire 3 days later. My name was on it in Callum Rowe's official letterhead, which meant someone had insisted. I thought about the man in the dream with the broken-tined crown and the certain eyes, and I folded the invitation and put it in my coat pocket, and I spent the next 2 weeks deciding what to wear. I chose black, simple, severe, with long sleeves that I could pull down if my hands began to glow at inconvenient moments. I braided my dark hair back from my face. I looked in the mirror and I thought, I have been in this hollow place for 2 years learning what I am. I would like the rest of the world to stop being so ignorant about it. The Luna ceremony of the Ironspire Pack was held at the Great Hall of Rowe Territory, a sprawling stone structure at the foot of the highlands that smelled of pine and cold iron. There were 200 wolves in attendance. The dacre was pale gold and white dahlias dewing, I assumed. There were flowers everywhere, and the flowers were ivory, and everything was immaculate, and it had the quality of a stage set, beautiful and slightly unreal, arranged to suggest permanence while being assembled for a single evening. I arrived alone, as I had been instructed. The door attendant found my name on the list with only a brief hesitation, and I walked into the great hall and found my place at one of the outer tables, and I sat down, and I waited. He saw me before I saw him. I felt it, the bond, fractured but not dead, pulling like a compass needle swinging toward north. Something fundamental in him had recognized something fundamental in me, and his body understood before his mind did, and across 200 wolves in one staged ceremony, his eyes found mine and stopped. Callum Rowe looked at me the way a man looks at something he told himself didn't exist, and is now having to revise his entire architecture to accommodate. I held his gaze for 3 seconds, then I looked away because I was not there for him. Daria noticed. She was standing at his side in an ivory gown with gold at the collar, and she followed the direction of his attention and she found me. And her expression did the thing that well-practiced faces do. It didn't change, but something behind it went very still. The ceremony began. It was traditional. The Alpha spoke of the bond, the intended Luna spoke of the pack. There were witnesses and a binding pronouncement, and the exchange of a claiming mark. I watched it with the attention I'd given to the genealogy books, clinical, precise, looking for what was actually true beneath what was being performed. What was true? Callum Rowe spoke his vows with the cadence of a man reciting a very important document. He was doing a thing that needed to be done, and he was doing it correctly, and there was no warmth in it. He was excellent at the surface of things. What was also true, the bond between us was not dormant. Every time he glanced in my direction, which was more than he intended to, I could see the effort it cost him not to. I felt it tighten. A rope, still taut, still there. When the ceremony reached the moment of the claiming mark, the great hall went very quiet. And then everything changed. The doors at the back of the hall opened, and the 200 wolves in attendance turned, and I turned with them, and the man from my dream walked in. He was exactly as I remembered, tall, gray-templed, with the weight of long authority and eyes that had been watching for a very long time. He was flanked by 4 wolves in formal black, each one carrying the insignia of the Alpha King's Council, and around his neck, on a chain of gold so old it had gone amber at the links, was the asymmetrical crown worn flat against his chest. Not a physical crown, a sigil medallion, the mark of the keeper of the Anchor bloodlines. His name, I would learn, was Aldrich. He was the Alpha King's chief emissary, the man who had sealed my file 23 years ago and arranged my residence at Ember Hollow and sent me the letters, and he walked into the Ironspire Great Hall with the calm of someone who has prepared for this moment for a very long time and is finally permitted to let it arrive. The Ironspire wolves were on their feet. Callum Rowe had gone pale. Daria was very still. Aldrich walked to the center of the hall, and he looked around the assembled gathering, and then he looked at me. "Seraphine Voss," he said, "the Alpha King requests your presence." There was a long silence. Callum Rowe's voice came out careful, trying to be authoritative, not quite making it. "She has no standing here. She's an unmated wolf from a minor territory." "She is no such thing." Aldrich's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. Seraphine Voss is the daughter of Merc Voss and the Alpha King's younger sister, Ilara, a union that was kept private by the king's own order to protect both mother and child from political targeting. Her bloodline is Anchor class, direct lineal descent from the founding wolves of the Northern Throne. She is, to be precise, the Alpha King's niece, and the Alpha King would like her to come home. 200 wolves went very quiet. I stood up. My hands were warm, and I didn't bother pulling my sleeves down. The gold light bled through the fabric anyway. I want to tell you what it felt like to stand in that hall with the truth finally spoken out loud, because I spent 2 years sitting with it. 2 years of blank paternal lines, and sealed files and dreams about fires. 2 years of learning what I was without being permitted to say it, and to hear it come from someone else's mouth in a room full of witnesses was a thing of a different magnitude entirely. It felt like setting down a very heavy thing I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was weight. Callum Rowe was looking at me. He was looking at me the way someone looks at a closed door when they realize too late that what was behind it was irreplaceable, and they cannot now undo the closing. I did not feel satisfaction. I want to be honest about that because the easy version of this story would give me a moment of triumph, the cold, clean pleasure of reversal. But what I actually felt was more complicated. I felt the bond between us, still fractured, still alive, and I felt the grief of what it had been and hadn't been allowed to become. And I felt something else, the particular clarity of a person who has spent 2 years in a hollow place learning who she is and is now, finally, ready to move. I walked through the crowd toward Aldrich. People stepped back without quite meaning to, not in fear, I think, but in the instinctive recognition that runs deeper than thought, the wolf brain acknowledging hierarchy before the human mind can form a sentence about it. The gold light was fully visible now, moving in the air around my hands and arms like bioluminescence, like something warm and alive. I stopped in front of Aldrich. He looked at me with those long watching eyes and said, very quietly, "You have your mother's eyes." I said, "I know, she told me before she died." A flicker in his face. "She wrote to you. Letters for the first 10 years, then nothing." I assumed the council made her stop. "The council made her stop," he confirmed, with the particular tone of a man who has followed orders he did not entirely endorse. "I am sorry for that. The king did not know, until recently, how little she was permitted to say." "Tell him I received them," I said. "Tell him I kept all of them." Something shifted in Aldrich's expression, a softening at the edges that I hadn't expected, and that made him look, briefly, like someone's uncle rather than the chief emissary of a ruling bloodline. He nodded. Then from behind me, Callum Rowe spoke. "Seraphine." I stopped. I didn't turn around immediately. I stood in the middle of the hall with my hands still lit, and I breathed, slow, from the belly, and I let him say it one more time to make sure I'd heard it right. "Seraphine." His voice had changed. The cold authority was gone. What was left underneath it was something rawer, something that sounded a great deal like a man who has just understood the full cost of a mistake he cannot take back. "I need to speak with you." I turned. He had come down from the ceremony platform. He was standing 8 feet from me without Daria beside him, which struck me as a significant distance from where he'd been 10 minutes ago. His jaw was set, and his gray eyes were doing something complicated. The bond pushing against his pride, visible on his face the way wolves' truest feelings always are when they're not actively suppressed. "You feel it," I said. "It wasn't a question." "I've always felt it." He said it quietly enough that it didn't carry just between us. I told myself the bond was in error. I told myself it had attached to the wrong person. "Wrong person," I repeated. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong about what that meant. I thought it meant the wrong rank, the wrong status." He stopped. I didn't understand what I was sensing. "You sensed Anchor blood," I said. "Your wolf knew before you did. That's what you were afraid of, a bond so old it didn't ask your permission." He looked at me steadily. "Yes." "I'm not asking you to apologize," I said. "I'm asking you to understand that what you did in front of the council, in front of the witnesses, left a mark. Not just on me, on the bond. The fracture doesn't simply seal because the circumstances changed." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I know it doesn't work that way." "Callum." Daria's voice came from the platform, measured, careful, but with an edge under it that I suspected only another woman would hear clearly. "The ceremony is concluded," he said without turning around. "The claiming mark was not given. I stopped it." He looked at me. "I stopped it before Aldrich came through the door." I stared at him. "When I saw you sit down," he said. "When you held my eyes and then looked away. Something," he stopped, pressed his hand against his sternum in a gesture so precisely identical to the one I had made in the Convergence Hall 2 years ago that I felt my breath catch. "Something made itself clear to me. I don't know how to say it more precisely than that. I thought about 2 years in Ember Hollow, about running in the cold mornings and the books and the glow at 3 in the morning, about the dream of the fire and the man with the watching eyes, saying, "It's almost time for them to know what you are." "The problem," I said, "is that I spent 2 years finding out who I am without you. And she, that version of me, who did that work alone, she doesn't need you to complete anything. She is already complete." He absorbed this, I know. "So if there's a conversation to be had," I said, "it would be about whether you're someone I want to walk beside, not someone I want. Those are different questions." "They are," he agreed. Behind him, Daria had gathered her things and was moving toward the side exit with 3 of her closest allies, and the bearing of a woman who knows she is lost, but intends to make the departure look deliberate. I watched her go and felt nothing complex about it. She had known the bond wasn't real and had built toward him anyway, which was its own kind of sad, and I didn't need to add to her evening. Aldrich had stepped back and was speaking quietly with his escort wolves, giving the hall its version of privacy. Around us, the 200 guests were not entirely succeeding at pretending not to watch. "I'm going to the Alpha King's court," I said. "Aldrich has been patient for 23 years, and I'm not going to make him wait through a longer conversation." "Of course," Callum's voice was steadier now. "May I? Is there a way to continue this?" I looked at him. Tall, gray-eyed, still carrying his pride even while it had just cost him something enormous, and the bond between us still there, fractured but not dead, the rope that had been taut for 2 years and had not, despite everything, unraveled. "Write to me," I said. "There's a courier who knows where Ember Hollow is. I'll be there for another week before I go south." I paused. "Actual letters. Not official documents." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Actual letters." "Yes." I walked to Aldrich, and Aldrich offered me his arm in the formal way, and we walked out of the Ironspire Hall together into the copper light of the Highland evening, which was still doing what it had been doing all season, burning, steady, refusing to go out. I stood at the entrance of the great hall for a moment after Callum's words, not frozen, just pausing to let things settle into their new configuration. The ceremony flowers were still in place. The candles were still burning. 200 wolves were doing that very careful thing where they pretend to be interested in their wine glasses and are absolutely not looking at you. Daria passed through the side exit without glancing back. I gave her the clean exit, without any additional witness. She'd built towards something that wasn't real and had come closer than she should have, and that was its own consequence without me adding to it. Aldrich was at my elbow. His 4 escort wolves had formed a loose, unobtrusive perimeter. Professionals, I thought, people who knew how to be present without looming. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," I said, then I stopped. Actually, one moment. I turned back to Callum. He was still where I'd left him, standing apart from the platform in the middle of the hall, with the expression of a man who has just finished falling and is still working out what he's landed on. Dignified, uncertain. More honest-looking than I'd expected a man of his bearing to be capable of in front of a crowd. "One more thing," I said. "The bond, you can feel what I'm feeling right now to some degree. The anchor line mates are more transparent to each other than standard bonds. You should know that." He looked at me steadily. "I know." "Then you know I'm not angry," I said. "I want to be precise about that. I was for a long time, at the convergence and for months after, but what I feel now is more like clarity, like a room where the furniture has finally been put in the right places." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you feel from me?" I considered. The bond fractured but alive, transmitting in the way old things transmit, not in words, in weather. "Something like standing in a high wind," I said. "Everything stripped back, nothing left you'd put there on purpose." His jaw tightened slightly, which I thought was honesty rather than offense. That's accurate. I know, I said. I'll write. I turned back to Aldrich. Now I'm ready. The drive south took 2 days. I sat in the back of the car with Aldrich beside me, and he talked for a long time about things I needed to know. About my mother, about the political circumstances that had made my existence inconvenient enough to hide, about the Alpha King himself, whose name was Edric, and who had spent 23 years trying to balance a promise he'd made to his dying sister against the instability that would follow if the truth came out too soon. He waited for you, Aldrich said. He did not push. He only arranged what needed to be arranged, the estate, the books, the access to the genealogy records. He wanted you to find it yourself. He could have told me, I said. He could have. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. He chose not to because the one time he interfered directly, the letter telling you to come to Ember Hollow, he almost lost you. You almost didn't get in the car. I was quiet. He learned to arrange conditions, Aldrich said, and then trust you to find your way through them. It was the only kind of respect he knew how to give at a distance. Outside the window, the highlands were giving way to the rolling country of the Middle Territories, and the sky was beginning to soften, the copper burning down at last into something closer to evening. I thought about my mother's letters, tied in their bundle at the bottom of my traveling case. I thought about a man who had kept his silence for 23 years out of a kind of love that was too large to express and too careful to impose. He sounds lonely, I said. He has been, Aldrich said, for a long time. The Alpha King's court was built into the side of a mountain, not carved into it, but grown from it. The stone walls so old they'd taken on the color and texture of the cliff face, indistinguishable until you were close enough to see the windows. There was a massive outer gate of black iron and an inner courtyard that smelled of pine and cold water, and it was nothing like what I had imagined and exactly what I should have expected. Ancient, substantial, uninterested in impressing anyone. Edric met me in the inner courtyard. He was the man from my dream, exactly, the gray temples, the watching eyes, the particular weight of long authority. But in person, there was something the dream hadn't included. A hesitation when he first saw me, a brief halt in his movement, as though the sight of me had caught him off guard despite the years of preparation. "You have your mother's eyes," he said. I had now been told this twice in one evening by 2 different people, and both times it had arrived like a key fitting a lock I hadn't known was there. "Everyone seems to agree on that," I said. Something in his face that might have been the ghost of a smile. Ilara would have been pleased to hear it. He looked at me for a moment more. "She spoke of you constantly, in the letters I was permitted to receive. She said you were born asking questions and never stopped." "Still haven't," I said. "Good," he said. "I have answers. I've been waiting a long time to give them." We walked inside. I will not tell you everything he told me that night, because some of it belongs only to me and to the family I am still in the process of understanding that I have. But the outline of it was this. My mother Ilara had mated in secret with Merk Voss, a mid-territory wolf of no particular political standing, but of anchor bloodline purity that was, the keeper's records confirmed, rarer than anything in the northern court. Their union produced a child whose blood carried both the royal line and the old anchor line undiluted. The child was me. And when Ilara died suddenly, of a fever, when I was 10 years old, Edric had done the only thing he could think of that would keep the child safe until the political climate made it possible to bring her home. He had hidden her, and waited, and arranged, and trusted that what was in the blood would find its way to the surface eventually. "The glow," I said. "The mark of the anchor line," he said. "It manifests when the bloodline is pure. It always has, historically. I'm told it was quite visible at the Iron Spire ceremony." "I stopped trying to suppress it a year ago," I said. "It kept coming anyway." He looked at my hands and nodded, with the expression of a man seeing confirmation of something he has known and waited for. It can't be suppressed permanently. It's not a symptom, it's a fact. I thought about the 2 years of 3 in the morning, the golden ceiling, the hands pressed together in the dark. I could have used that information sooner, I said, without accusation, just as a statement of fact. You could have, he agreed. I was cautious where I should have been clear. I will try to do better going forward, if you'll allow me the opportunity. He said it carefully, with the particular care of someone who knows they have no right to assume the opportunity will be granted. It was the most honest thing I'd heard said in 2 days, and it landed in me differently than I expected. Not as an excuse, not as a manipulation, just as a human admission from a man who had made imperfect decisions in an impossible situation, and was still here, saying so. I'll allow it, I said. Provisionally. That seems entirely fair. We ate dinner in a room with tall windows that looked out over the mountain slope, and I asked my questions and he answered them. And at some point, I realized that I was sitting across a table from my family, and the recognition of that was simultaneously enormous and very simple. A fact that was true whether I was prepared for it or not, settling into my body the way truths do. Afterward, he showed me the library. It was 4 times the size of the one at Ember Hollow, with the same genealogy records but also centuries of correspondence, diplomatic histories, pack law treatises, and along one entire wall, a collection of my mother's personal journals that Edric had kept in archival cases since she died. She wanted you to have them, he said. When the time came. I stood in front of those archival cases for a long time. The time had come. I want to tell you about the first council meeting, because it is where I understood something about myself that Ember Hollow had been building toward for 2 years without my knowing. The Alpha King's council met in a long room with a table of dark oak and high windows that looked north, toward the territories. There were 11 council members, all senior wolves of various bloodlines, most of whom had known my mother and none of whom had known me, and they had very specific opinions about my existence that they had apparently been holding in reserve for the better part of 20 years. Edric introduced me. He used my full name and my full lineage, daughter of Alara, sister of the Alpha King and Merc Voss, anchor bloodline direct descent. He did it in the flat, factual tone of someone presenting information that is not subject to debate, and he did it while looking at one specific council member, an older woman named Counselor Veth who had, Aldrich had told me in the car, been the loudest voice 23 years ago for keeping my existence sealed indefinitely. Counselor Veth looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "She doesn't look royal." My mother raised me in a minor territory with a small house and a large garden, I said. I can acquire the look if the council feels it's important. I've read extensively on the subject. A pause around the table. Edric made a very small sound that might have been the suppression of a laugh. What I cannot acquire, I continued, is the bloodline which I already have, or the mark, which appeared of its own accord and continues to do so. What the council needs to decide, as I understand it, is not whether I am what Aldrich says I am, the records confirm that, but what my position here means in practical terms going forward. Counselor Veth's expression shifted incrementally, not warmth exactly, more like recalibration. "You've read the council charter," she said. "I've read the council charter, the territorial law addenda from the last 4 centuries, the anchor bloodline protocols, and the full record of my mother's council tenure," I said. "She sat on this council for 6 years before her death. I found the minutes." Another pause. "She sat in the 3rd chair," Edric said quietly from the head of the table, "the same chair you're in now." I looked down at the chair I'd chosen at random when I came in. The wood was slightly more worn than the others. I put my hands flat on the arms of it and felt the gold warm in my palms, gentle and steady, And I thought about a woman I had known for 10 years, and then only through letters and journals, and I breathed. Then this seems like the right place to start, I said. The council voted that afternoon to formally recognize my status. It was 7-4, which Aldrich told me afterward was significantly better than he'd expected, and Councillor Veth had been one of the 7, which he said he had not expected at all. You argued the legal case before she could, he said. She respects precedent, she always has. I could tell, I said. The way she cited the charter twice before I came in, she was building a framework and I gave her a better one. He looked at me with the particular expression I was beginning to recognize as his version of being impressed. Your mother used to do that too, he said. Read the room and find the fastest path through it. I had a lot of time to practice reading, I said. I should tell you about the bond, because you are probably wondering. Callum Rowe's first letter arrived at Ember Hollow on the Thursday after the ceremony, 3 days earlier than I'd expected. It was handwritten, on plain paper, in handwriting that was careful and slightly cramped. The handwriting of someone who doesn't write many things by hand anymore and was trying to do it properly regardless. He wrote about the ceremony, about the moment he'd stopped it, which had apparently been more complicated than he'd made it sound in the Great Hall, Daria had argued, calmly, and with the assurance of someone who believed the bond would hold and the Alpha would come to his senses. And Callum had looked at her and known with a finality he couldn't explain that it wasn't going to hold, because it had never been real, and she had known that too. And what she'd been building toward wasn't a mate bond. It was a strategic alliance. And strategic alliances didn't survive the moment when the Alpha realized he'd been offered a mirror instead of a window. He was not cruel about Daria. He wrote about her with a kind of weary clarity, as though he'd spent time since the ceremony trying to be honest with himself about what they'd actually been to each other, and the honesty hadn't been flattering to either of them. He wrote, I want to be clear that what I'm feeling now isn't simply guilt about the rejection or relief about your status. I've done enough thinking in the past 3 days to distinguish those things from what's actually there. What's actually there predates the Ironspire Hall and predates Aldrich's arrival and predates the last 2 years. It was there at the convergence, and I spent 2 years telling myself it wasn't, and I am not at my most comfortable admitting that. He did not ask me to forgive him. He simply described, with the plainness of someone making an honest account rather than a plea, what he understood about what had happened. I wrote back, actual letter as specified. I wrote about Ember Hollow and the books and the 3 in the morning glow, because he deserved to understand what his rejection had cost and also what it had produced. I wrote, I don't think I would have found the genealogy files if I hadn't had 2 years of enforced solitude and a library full of things nobody thought I'd read. There is an argument, though I'm not making it on your behalf, that being rejected at 23 was the condition under which I discovered who I am. I added, I am not making that argument on your behalf. He wrote back and said, I understand. I appreciate the precision. We wrote for 6 weeks. I was at the Alpha King's court for most of it, beginning the long work of understanding my place there, meeting the council members who had known my mother and the younger wolves who hadn't, learning the particular rhythms of a family I was simultaneously native to and new to. Edric was careful and consistent, and showed up to every meal I was at, and we were figuring out carefully what it looked like to be related to each other after 23 years of protected distance. I still ran every morning. The court had its own highland terrain, sharper and older than Asheville, the paths worn deep by generations of wolves. The first time I ran in shifted form since I'd lifted my rule was at dawn on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after I arrived, when I woke in a room that finally felt like mine and decided it was time. The shift was like coming back to a language I'd grown up speaking. My wolf form was larger than most. Anchor bloodlines run large, the old record said, something about the original wolves and their proximity to whatever made the first bonds. And she was gold-furred, which I hadn't been expecting, but which made the mark of the anchor line suddenly make a great deal of contextual sense. I ran the ridge paths until the sun was fully up, and then I shifted back and stood in the cold air and felt, for the first time in 2 years, entirely myself. I called Callum from the ridge. He answered on the second ring, which told me something. "I shifted this morning," I said. "I've been holding it for 2 years. I made a rule." A pause. What was the rule? No shifting until I had answers. I was afraid of what she'd do if I let her out before I understood what we were carrying. "What did she do?" "She ran," I said. "For 2 hours. She's gold. I didn't know that." Another pause, different in quality from the first. "I know," he said quietly. "You know." "The bond," he said. "I've always had a sense of your wolf, even fractured. I've always known she was gold." I stood on the ridge in the cold air with that piece of information, and felt it settle somewhere important. "Callum," I said. "Yes." "The fracture doesn't simply seal," I said. "I told you that. I meant it. Whatever we build from here has to be built, not recovered. We don't get to go back." "I know." His voice was steady. "I'm not trying to go back. I'm trying to go forward if you're willing." "I think I'm willing," I said. "I'm not certain yet." "That seems honest." "I've been practicing honesty," I said. "I had a lot of time to practice." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I didn't expect. "I've been reading, since the ceremony, history of the Anchor bloodlines, the legal and cultural history, not just the genealogy. I wanted to understand what you were carrying before I said anything else about what I want." I thought about that. About a man who had made a serious mistake, and decided that the appropriate response was not to apologize his way back into proximity, but to go and learn what he hadn't known. "What did you learn?" I asked. "That the anchor line mates don't follow the usual rules," he said. "That the bond is older and different, and that the right question isn't whether it fits the protocol. It's whether the two people carrying it are willing to do the work of being worth each other." I looked out over the ridge, over the old highland terrain, over the court that was my birthright and the family that was coming back to me slowly, and the 2 years of solitude that had made me into someone who knew what she was carrying. "Write me that," I said, "in a letter so I can keep it." A pause. "The letter might take a few days. I want to say it precisely." "Take your time," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." The letter took 4 days and ran to 7 pages, and it was the most careful thing I had ever been given. I read it twice, and then I placed it with my mother's letters in the archival case I'd been given for my personal correspondence, and I went and found Edric in his study and sat down across from him and said, "I have a question about the process for a bond renegotiation between an anchor-class wolf and an alpha of a northern territory." He looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "That is an extremely specific question." "I do thorough research," I said. He took his glasses off entirely. The watching eyes, the long familiarity with waiting. "The process exists," he said carefully. "It requires a formal request through the council, a period of documented courtship under the council's acknowledgement, and a representation before at least 6 witnesses, one of whom must be of anchor class or above." "You would qualify," I said. "I would," he said, "as it happens." "And the fracture," I said, "in a renegotiated bond, can it be repaired?" He was quiet for a moment. "The records say the fracture heals over time if both parties are genuine and consistent. It doesn't disappear. The memory of it stays, but the rope reknits." He paused. "Your mother's bond with your father healed after a very difficult first 2 years. She wrote to me about it. She said it never felt fragile again after that. It felt stronger, actually, because it had been tested and had held." I thought about a rope, about 2 years of it hanging taut and fraying, and the knowledge that it had not, despite everything, unraveled. "I'll need to send a letter to Ironspire," I said. "I assumed you would," Edric said. He opened his desk drawer, produced a sheet of court stationery, and slid it across to me without expression. The seal is in the top right drawer if you need it. I looked at the stationery. I looked at him. You have had this planned, I said. I have had it hoped, he said, with the precision of a man choosing his words carefully, which is not quite the same thing. I wrote the letter to Callum that afternoon in the study at Edric's desk, on Alpha King's court stationery with the official seal, because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it properly, and I was going to do it from the position of someone who knew exactly who she was. I wrote, I have consulted the records. There is a process. I would like to begin it, if you are prepared for the work it requires and the time it will take, and the fact that it will be witnessed and documented, and that neither of us will be able to undo it quietly if we change our minds. I added, I should tell you that I am not doing this because I need you. I am doing this because, after considerable reflection, I want you, specifically you, with your careful letters and your cramped handwriting, and your recently acquired knowledge of Anchor bloodline history. I am doing this because the bond between us is 2 years fractured and still alive, and I have spent enough time in hollow places to know that the things that survive that long are worth building on. I sealed it with the court seal, my first use of it, my right by blood. Aldrich delivered it personally, because Aldrich, I was beginning to understand, had been arranging things carefully for 23 years and was not about to stop now. Callum's reply came in 2 days, which was, if anything, faster than his first letter. It said, yes, to all of it, I will do the work. I understand the time. I am not afraid of witnesses. It said, I have a question about the formal request to the council. Do I submit it directly or does it go through your uncle? And then at the bottom, in the cramped and careful handwriting, I've been thinking about what you said, that you're not doing this because you need me. I want you to know that I understand the difference between those things now, which I didn't fully before. And I want you to know that I don't need you either, in the sense of require in order to function. But I want you in the way that I think is the only honest reason to do this. Because who you are specifically, the version of you that ran for 2 years in the Highlands and read every book in a hollow house, and stood in a ceremony hall with gold on her hands, and looked at me like I was a problem she had already solved. That is someone I would choose deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost. I read that letter in the courtyard with the mountain above me, and the cold air doing what cold air does in the Highlands, stripping away the inessential, leaving only what was solid and real. I folded it and put it with the others. And then I went and found Edric to ask about the council process, because I was my mother's daughter and my uncle's niece, and the inheritor of an Anchor bloodline that had survived 2 years of fracture and a hollow house and a sky that wouldn't go dark, and I did not do things halfway. The formal request to the council was submitted jointly, Callum's name first, as the petitioning Alpha, mine second as the Anchor-class Wolf acknowledging the petition. Councillor Veth reviewed it personally and sent back 4 questions about the documented history of the fracture and its circumstances. I answered all 4 in detail. She sent back a single line, "This is sufficient for the record. The petition is accepted." The period of documented courtship lasted 4 months. I will not pretend those 4 months were smooth. There was the matter of Callum's pack, who had watched their Alpha halt a Luna ceremony and felt the disruption of that in the way packs feel all things, collectively, in their bones. The wolves who had aligned closely with Daria were unsettled. The elder wolves who had known the old bloodline histories were, unexpectedly, steadying forces. A few of them had enough memory to know what it meant when the Anchor line reappeared, and they moved through the pack with a quiet authority about it that helped. Callum came north twice in those 4 months. The first visit was official. He met with Edric and Aldrich and sat through the formal council interview that was part of the documented courtship process. He was impeccably prepared. He'd clearly spent time in the records, because when Counselor Veth pressed him on the legal history of fractured bond renegotiations, he answered without hesitation. And the counselor made the same incrementally shifting expression she'd made at me during my first meeting. Afterward, I found him in the courtyard, reading a history volume he'd taken from the library without asking. "You can just take books," I said. "You don't have to look like you're stealing." He looked up from the page. I wasn't sure of the protocol. "The protocol is, it's a library. The whole function of a library is that people read the books." I sat down across the courtyard from him, which was the appropriate distance for a documented courtship under counsel's supervision. "How is the pack?" "Adjusting," he said. "The elder wolves have been helpful. There are 3 of them who apparently knew of anchor bloodline traditions from their grandparents, and have spent the last 2 months telling anyone who will listen what it means that the mark appeared." "What are they telling them?" "That it means the bond is legitimate in a way that goes beyond the usual," he said. "That it doesn't attach to rank or territory, it attaches to something older. That the wolves who carry it don't choose it and can't refuse it, and the best thing an alpha can do when it appears is have the sense to get out of its way." He paused. "One of them said, in front of 12 pack members at dinner, that my rejection was the most expensive mistake made by an Ironspire alpha in 4 generations." I looked at him. Was he wrong? "No," he said. "He was not remotely wrong." He closed the book. He looked at me across the courtyard in the flat afternoon light, with no ceremony flowers and no 200 witnesses, and none of the stage-set quality of the Ironspire Hall, just the mountain above us and the cold air, and the 2 of us being precise about what was true. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said at the ceremony, that the version of you who did those 2 years alone doesn't need me to complete anything." I remember saying that. "You're right," he said, "and I've been trying to make sense of what that means for what I'm asking, not to talk you out of it. To understand what I'm actually asking for." "What conclusion did you reach?" He was quiet for a moment, with the thoughtful stillness I'd come to recognize as his real expression when the authority was stripped away, not cold, just careful. "I think I'm asking to be someone who is worth being chosen by a woman who has no reason to need choosing, which is a different proposition than I've ever operated with before. It requires me to be genuinely worth it, not just by rank." "Yes," I said, "it does. I'm working on that." "I can see that," I said, "and I could." His second visit was less official and somewhat longer. He came at the end of the 3rd month on a clear day that smelled like the first edge of winter, and Edric received him at the gate with the pleasant neutrality of a man who has decided to trust the process and is watching it carefully regardless. Callum brought Edric a territorial history of Ironspire that apparently filled a gap in the court library. A gift chosen with the specific attention of someone who'd spent time thinking about what would be genuinely wanted rather than simply impressive. Edric thanked him and sent us to walk the ridge paths with Aldrich at a discreet distance, which was as close to alone as the documented courtship permitted. We walked for 2 hours. We talked about the council and the pack and the letters we'd exchanged, 23 by that point, some of which had covered ground that wasn't particularly comfortable, the history of the fracture from both sides, the things we'd each failed to say and think, and the reason why. There was a moment somewhere on the upper ridge where the conversation went quiet in the way that comfortable silences do, not from a lack of things to say, but because what was being communicated didn't require words. I stopped at the high point of the ridge, where the view opened in 3 directions over the territory. "The bond," I said, "can you feel the difference?" He stopped beside me. His hands were in his coat pockets, shoulders relaxed. He looked out over the view for a moment. "Yes," he said. "The weather analogy you used at the hall, it's changed. There's less wind." "Less wind," I agreed. "More like early morning still, but not empty." He looked at me. The gray eyes without the authority performance, without the cold competence of a man doing what was required. just looking. I don't want to push for more than the process allows, he said. But I want you to know that I would rather spend the rest of this documented courtship period walking ridge paths with you in the cold than doing anything else I've done in the last 4 months combined. That's a very restrained declaration, I said. I'm trying to be appropriate. Callum, I turned to face him fully. The gold was warm in my hands. It always ran warmer near him, had for months, an observable fact I'd noted without telling him until now. I said I was willing. I said I wasn't certain yet. I want to update that. He went still. I'm certain now, I said. I've been certain for about 6 weeks. I was being precise about the timeline because I didn't want to mistake momentum for clarity, but it's clarity. I paused. The hollow feeling, the one I've carried since the convergence. It's been gone since the second letter. I kept waiting for it to come back. It hasn't. He let out a breath that sounded like something he'd been holding for considerably longer than the current conversation. 6 weeks, he said. Give or take. And you're telling me now. The second visit seemed more appropriate than a letter, I said. Some things benefit from being said in person. He reached out, slowly and deliberately, and took one of my warm, glowing hands in both of his. He looked at the gold light for a moment, the mark of the anchor line, the proof of what I was, the thing that had blazed in the Iron Spire Hall in front of 200 witnesses. He held my hand as though it were something precious and not at all alarming, which was, I thought, the right response. What comes after the formal request and the documented courtship? He asked. A representation, I said, before 6 witnesses, one of anchor class or above. Your uncle. My uncle, I confirmed. Who will be, as he puts it, hoping rather than planning. He laughed, a real one, quiet and sudden, the sound of something releasing. That sounds like a man who has thought about it extensively. He has had 23 years of practice, I said. We walked back down the ridge in the low winter light, Aldrich at his discreet distance, the mountain above us and the court visible below. My hand was still in his. The bond was not the weather of a high wind anymore. It was, as I'd said, early morning, still and clear and full of the specific potential of days that haven't yet decided what they're going to be. The representation happened a month later, on a morning in early winter when the frost was sharp on the courtyard stones. 6 witnesses, Edric, Aldrich, Councillor Veth, 2 senior wolves of Callum's own pack, the elder ones who had spent months telling everyone what the anchor line meant, and my mother's oldest friend in the court, a quiet woman named Marin who had kept every letter Ilara ever sent her and brought them to give me the first week I arrived, because, she said, she'd been keeping them for whoever Ilara's daughter turned out to be. There was no stage set, no ceremony flowers, no 200 guests performing attention, just the 6 witnesses and the cold morning and the frost and the 2 of us standing in the Alpha King's courtyard with the mountain behind us. The bond representation is a simple thing by design, not a ceremony so much as a declaration, a naming of what is true. Callum spoke first. He said, I see you. I know what I failed to see before, and I have done the work to understand it, and I am standing here because I choose to stand here, not because protocol requires it. I said, I see you. I came through 2 years of being hidden and being incomplete, and I came through it whole, and I am standing here because I choose to stand here, and I am not afraid of what we're carrying. Edric, as the anchor class witness, made the formal notation in the council record that the bond had been presented, acknowledged, and accepted by both parties in full awareness of its nature and history. Then he looked at me for a moment with those long-watching eyes, the weight of 23 years of care that had not been able to find its proper shape until now, and he said, quietly and only to me, Your mother would have been very proud. I did not cry, because there are some things I will not do in front of 6 witnesses. But I let myself feel it, the full weight of it, the grief and the joy together, the hollow finally filled, the rope reknit. I let it be true. Then I turned back to Callum, who was looking at me with the stripped-back expression and the gray eyes that were, in the cold morning light, the warmest thing in the courtyard. "Early morning," I said. He understood. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." The sun was finally setting. Not the endless copper of the blood moon season that had passed at last into the gentler light of the turning year. The sky above the court was doing the full range of colors it had been holding back. Amber, then rose, then the first deep blue of real evening. I stood at the courtyard gate and watched it and thought, I know what I am. I know who I come from. I know what I'm carrying, and I know it's worth carrying, and I know now, for the first time in 2 years, that the hollow is behind me. The light finally went out. And then the stars,